Chapter 1. The Future is Now, 1989 to 2000. Highlighted by obstacles overcome, heroic acts, and watershed moments, the history of nurse anesthesia has rarely suffered a dull moment. The 1990s proved to be no exception. CRNAs in the last decade of the 20th century continued to build upon the legacy of their predecessors. Throughout the history of the profession, CRNAs have operated largely in the background as what some have referred to as the best-kept secret in healthcare. Indeed, Mary Ann Bankert, author of Watchful Care, A History of America's Nurse Anesthetists, characterized the daunting task of researching the profession's beginnings as a search for the invisible providers. By century's end, however, the struggle for legitimacy had propelled CRNAs and their professional association to the forefront of national politics at a moment when the American healthcare system was proving untenable. Millions of Americans became aware of the literal army of nurses working in various specialties that had kept a sinking ship afloat. Increased awareness brought much deserved recognition, but also a fair degree of animosity from those who stood to lose from greater reliance on CRNAs. Budget cuts and workplace discrimination were not the only obstacles CRNAs would have to surmount in the 1990s. The Persian Gulf War brought CRNAs to the front lines of military conflict, once again providing the lion's share of anesthesia services for members of the U.S. Armed Forces and Iraqi citizens. CRNAs also faced greater peril in civilian practice as fears over HIV and AIDS reached a fever pitch in the early 1990s, with infections approaching a CDC estimated 750,000 Americans by 1990. What was more, the AANA stared down a glaring CRNA shortage in addition to challenges to its systems of education, accreditation, and recertification. Yet, as has been the case throughout the history of the profession, CRNAs and their state and national organizations proved up to these challenges. With a new millennium on the horizon, the profession of nurse anesthesia steeled itself for the future. And the future, as it turns out, was global. Nurse anesthesia on the world stage. The founding of the IFNA and NAO, 1989 to 1995. While participation by American nurse anesthetists in World Wars I and II introduced nurse anesthesia to the world, the contemporary roots of what would become the International Federation of Nurse Anesthetists, IFNA, stemmed from the participation of two European nurse anesthetists in the 1978 AANA annual meeting in Detroit, Michigan. Many CRNAs at the time were unaware that nurse anesthetists existed outside of the United States, as it had long been argued by the ASA that America was the only civilized country that allowed nurses to perform anesthesia services. So when nurse anesthetists Hermine Lahnert from Switzerland and Jan Franzen from Denmark attended the meeting in Detroit, it caused quite a stir. Lahnert took the opportunity to inquire as to the willingness of the AANA to work toward development of an organization to facilitate cooperation among nurse anesthetists worldwide. The AANA was excited by the prospect and helped organize the first international symposium for nurse anesthetists in 1985 in Lucerne, Switzerland. The symposium drew a respectable 250 nurse anesthetists from 13 countries. 3 years later, the second International Symposium for Nurse Anesthetists was held in Amsterdam with 511 nurse anesthetists in attendance. Impressed by the interest and participation it witnessed, the AANA began working toward assisting its European associates with the formation of an international organization. From these discussions, the IFNA was born. The goals of the IFNA were straightforward. First and foremost, it was founded to facilitate the cooperation of nurse anesthetists around the world. To this end, it sought to promote standards of education and practice that would facilitate the worldwide growth of nurse anesthesia. Spearheaded by American CRNA Ronald Kalk, the AANA's involvement was not unlike that of John R. Mannix and the AHA's support of the nascent NANA a half-century earlier. The AANA had learned a lot from its near 60-year organizational history and was eager to assist the IFNA in navigating these early years. To date, the AANA's multifaceted support remains a driving force behind the IFNA's mission. In fact, 3 of the 6 IFNA presidents to date have been former AANA presidents, including Koch, 1990 to 1995, Sandra Marie Ouellette from 2004 to 2010, and Jackie Rawls, 2014 to present. The IFNA was formally founded on June 10, 1989, in a hospital attic in Teufen, Switzerland, with Lahnert elected as president. Koch, who had been selected as the inaugural vice president, reflected on the experience, noting it had been an honor to know you have played a role in such a historic event. The original 11 participating nations included Austria, West Germany, Finland, France, Iceland, Norway, South Korea, Sweden, Switzerland, Yugoslavia, and the United States. The first step toward the IFNA realizing its goals meant establishing itself financially. As Koch observed at the time, once the IFNA has established a firm financial basis, we would like to provide assistance in nurse anesthetist education in third world countries. But before assistance could be offered, a thorough study had to be made in order to assess the practice and educational conditions faced by nurse anesthetists the world over. To this end, the IFNA and AANA Council on Recertification of Nurse Anesthetists, COR, sponsored a study to be carried out by Mara S. McAuliffe, CRNA. McAuliffe, who had recently received her Ph.D. in Nursing Education and Administration from the University of Texas at Austin School of Nursing, had nearly a decade of experience in clinical practice and teaching graduate-level education in nurse anesthesia. Between 1993 and 1996, McAuliffe and Professor Beverly Henry of the University of Illinois College of Nursing conducted a 3-phase study sponsored by the AANA and IFNA to assess the state of nurse anesthesia practice, education, and regulation around the world. Their initial findings suggested that much of the anesthesia care worldwide was being performed by nurses. Phase 1 of the study was aimed at getting sufficient hard data to determine the quantity and quality of care these nurse anesthetists provided. Respondents from 107 countries, or roughly 59% of all World Health Organization (WHO) member states, reported that nurse anesthetists provided at least some of the anesthesia care within their borders. 9 countries reported that nurses assisted in giving anesthesia, leaving 18 nations as having provided inconclusive data necessary for the second phase of the study. In total, of the 624 nurse anesthetists who responded in Phase 1 of the study, 299 went on to participate in Phase 2. Overall, respondents from 92 countries were ultimately represented in the study. They reported that nurse anesthetists provided upwards of 77% of all anesthetics in urban areas and 75% in rural areas. In the hospitals where they worked, they reported that nurse anesthetists performed 85% of the anesthesia for cesarean sections. Of those surveyed, 77% reported that they administered drugs to induce anesthesia. 74 to 77% performed tracheal intubation and extubation. 57% and 44% performed spinal and epidural anesthesia, respectively, and 79% managed anesthetized patients intraoperatively, while 54% managed them in the immediate postoperative period. With regard to supervision requirements, 57%, mainly from European countries, were required to be supervised by a physician, which meant that a staggering 43% reported no supervision requirements. Perhaps most significant for the IFNA was that many needed to travel to other countries to receive their education. McAuliffe's study confirmed what the AANA and IFNA had suspected. A large number of nurse anesthetists worldwide were performing the majority of anesthesia care in their respective countries, and many of them would benefit from improved access to continuing education and/or supportive legislation. While the roots of CRNA involvement in overseas nonprofits can be traced back to the late 1960s, the rise of the IFNA gave global volunteer health efforts a proverbial shot in the arm. 2 organizations stand out in this arena: Health Volunteers Overseas, HVO, and Nurse Anesthetists Overseas, NAO, founded in 1986 and 1992 respectively. Inspired by a Journal of American Medicine article titled Doctors Across the Sea by Ralph Crenshaw, MD, the HVO sought to address critical deficits in access to quality care among poorer and otherwise disadvantaged nations. Committed to teaching in addition to providing care, the HVO brought specialists from several different fields into face-to-face interaction with international communities in need. Given the AANA's early support and enthusiasm for the HVO, it was somewhat inevitable that the NAO would come into existence. On July 31, 1992, the AANA Board of Directors gave its approval to the principal funding of the NAO as a new subdivision of anesthesia overseas, and its parent organization, the HVO. The NAO offered a path for CRNAs to volunteer and hone their skills as anesthesia educators, while simultaneously providing experience in administration. Given that the AANA was concomitantly ramping up its education infrastructure in response to nursing shortages in the United States, such experience was particularly valuable to individual CRNAs as well as to the field at large. As a part of its enthusiastic support for the NAO, the AANA dedicated numerous resources, including a volunteer resource directly mailed to interested members at no cost. Using these resources, CRNAs could find opportunities to volunteer and develop their talents abroad, whether within or outside the HVO. In a little over a year, the NAO boasted 170 CRNA members who provided anesthesia care and education to programs in nations including but not limited to Uganda, St. Lucia, Guyana, and Eritrea. With the support of the AANA and IFNA, these programs received donations of cash and educational materials that made a tremendous difference to communities the world over. In addition, some programs were so successful that they facilitated the founding of new schools, such as the new 2-year nurse anesthetist training program in Georgetown, Guyana. The AANA actively promoted the NAO and HVO in the monthly AANA News Bulletin, encouraging members to donate their materials, time, and/or money to facilitate these worthwhile programs. Individual experiences shared by CRNA volunteers overseas were also invaluable to the success of these programs. CRNA Fred Welke of Winona, Minnesota, said of his time teaching at the anesthesia school in Guyana, "The rewards of watching students grow as anesthetists far outweighed the few sacrifices made by me." Other programs, such as Operation Smile and Surgical and Medical Relief Teams, SMART, also greatly benefited from CRNA volunteer efforts. CRNA Reservist Technical Sergeant Arnold T. Stocker began volunteering his services with Operation Smile in 1996, providing anesthesia services to children suffering from cleft palates in Vietnam, Gaza, Venezuela, and China. Likewise, CRNAs John Huggard III, Deborah Ann Schneider, Robert Chauvin, and Brian Steeland joined a group of 30 physicians working within SMART to provide corrective surgical services to more than 50 infants in Guatemala. To list every overseas volunteer effort conducted by CRNAs would require several volumes of text in and of itself, not to mention the multitude of volunteer efforts that CRNAs have participated in the United States. Our sincerest appreciation goes to those who have given their time, money, and energy to this important work. Thus, the IFNA and NAO had established both a need for the services of nurse anesthetists and demonstrated opportunities for them to expand into new geographic areas. For the AANA and CRNAs, the early success of the IFNA was a proud moment. Likewise, the NAO had both inspired and provided necessary care to many patients around the world. But while facilitating opportunities and enrichment for nurse anesthetists overseas merited their time and effort, there were still hurdles to be cleared at home. There would be long battles, small victories, and frustrating setbacks. But it was the grit and determination of CRNAs and their leadership during the 1990s that would pay dividends for nurse anesthesia in the coming millennium. Under the knife, lobbying for fair reimbursement amidst domestic spending cuts. In his second term as AANA president, Richard Ouellette watched what he perceived to be the government's failure to measure up to our nation's healthcare needs play out like political theater before him. As the 1980s came to a close, the American healthcare system found itself in a precarious position. The short-lived Medicare Catastrophic Coverage Act had become a political poison pill, as powerful lobbies mobilized the elderly against what President Reagan's self-proclaimed deficit hawks deemed an entitlement scheme to raise taxes. Such had been the playbook for defeating healthcare reform for the better part of a decade. Any and all domestic spending proposed by Congress or its associated committees came under immense scrutiny, as domestic spending cuts were necessary to offset the enormous national defense budgets the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations had overseen. While some much-needed reforms to Medicare, particularly measures to double rural case volumes, were ultimately rescued in a deficit reduction bill, a myriad of others, including a proposal to increase CRNA reimbursement under Medicare, were removed in a last-minute attempt by the 101st Congress to appease the Bush administration. The AANA's $14 and $21 proposal suggested revising Medicare's fee schedule by increasing compensation for anesthesia services provided by CRNAs under the supervision of an anesthesiologist to $14 per time unit, up from $8.30. Similarly, self-directed care, or services in which the CRNA worked independently, would have garnered $21 per time unit, up from $14.40. On its merits alone, the provision enjoyed bipartisan support in health advisory committees and initially faced little, if any, opposition in the House of Representatives. Unfortunately, the Senate's blanket rejection of any additional domestic spending spelled the end for the proposal. Unwilling to concede defeat, Ouellette encouraged members to write their congressional representatives in both the House and Senate while continuing to provide the high level of care that had defined the profession for nearly a century. Mobilizing under the theme, "The Future is Now," the AANA asked its members to steel themselves for the challenges ahead, as nurse anesthesia was in a critical state. CRNA shortages, declining enrollment, and the shuttering of education programs tested the profession like never before. Adequate reimbursement would go a long way toward addressing these concerns. Thus, in the face of the current crisis in American healthcare, exacerbated by an obstinate legislative majority determined to hold the line on domestic spending, the AANA and its membership faced one of their greatest challenges to date. At the same time, CRNAs still had the reason to feel optimistic. Just over 3 years earlier, after a similarly long and arduous grassroots campaign, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, OBRA, of 1986 approved direct reimbursement for CRNAs as providers of Medicare services. This recognition provided much-needed evidence of legitimacy that would serve as a foundation for future lobbying efforts. Yet, as long as reimbursement remained low, efforts to bolster student enrollment in order to meet growing demands for anesthesia providers would prove difficult. In so many words, the AANA and its membership understood that CRNA reimbursement under Medicare, both supervised and self-directed, needed to reflect their talents and abilities in order for the profession to flourish in the coming millennium. Over the next several months, the grassroots mobilization of CRNAs began paying dividends. Responding to letters from the AANA and its membership regarding the significance of CRNAs to rural health care, Congressman Terry Bruce, Democrat in Illinois, along with 6 co-sponsors, introduced an amendment to the Rural Health Improvement Act of 1990 on January 25, 1990. Within the act was an amendment to revise the $14 and $21 proposal. As CRNAs had long provided the lion's share of rural anesthesia services at rates affordable to patients and hospitals alike, it followed that fair reimbursement would incentivize CRNAs to seek employment in rural communities. In many cases, rural CRNAs operated as the sole anesthesia care providers in their communities. As rural hospitals lacked the budget necessary to incentivize anesthesiologists to abandon more lucrative and stimulating urban practices, it was imperative that CRNAs continued to fill that gap. Packaging CRNA reimbursement legislation with rural healthcare reform acts was both politically expedient and logically sound. Without reliable and affordable anesthesia services, rural hospitals would be hard-pressed to provide a range of revenue-generating services. Without sufficient revenue-generating services, these hospitals would be forced to either close or dramatically reduce the services offered to their patients. Indeed, the presence of 1 or 2 nurse anesthetists could prove to be the difference for a rural hospital's fiscal solvency. Peggy Clemens, director of nursing at Dormany Medical Center in Fitzgerald, Georgia, testified before a state commission that their hospital turned a $1.6 million annual deficit into a $22,000 budget surplus, largely due to the recruitment of a single surgeon and 2 CRNAs. Senators and representatives of rural states understood the significance of CRNAs to rural hospitals to maintain the health of their constituents. Speaking to the integral care they provided at rural hospitals, Senator Robert Packwood, Democrat of Oregon, asserted if CRNAs were not there, these hospitals would close. Senator Packwood was far from alone in his endorsement. By June of that year, 58 representatives, 38 Democrats, 20 Republicans, and 21 senators, 10 Democrats, 11 Republicans, had signed on to co-sponsor the House and Senate versions of the legislation, respectively. Even more legislators would ultimately throw their support behind the measure ahead of the vote anticipated in the fall of 1990. Should the Rural Health Improvement Act have been placed before President Bush, he would have been hard-pressed to veto a bill aimed at a key constituency of the Republican Party, rural Americans. This support proved sufficient, as the Rural Health Improvement Act of 1990 was folded into the OBRA of 1990, including a proposal to amend the CRNA fee schedule, H.R. 4485 and S. 2041. The OBRA passed Congress on October 27th and was signed into law by President Bush on November 5, 1990. Unfortunately, concerns over the fiscal impact of some of these provisions meant the final versions of both bills needed to be watered down in order to pass Congress. While the gains CRNAs achieved were more modest than what the association and its members had lobbied for, $11.70 and $16.75, as opposed to $14 and $21, the AANA's Director of Federal Government Affairs, Kathleen A. Michaels, argued the result was favorable given the fiscal and political realities of the moment. The proposal also provided that, where permissible, CRNAs supervising other anesthesia providers would be compensated at levels similar to their physician colleagues. Though shy of its original goals, the significance of this political victory cannot be overstated. A favorable adjustment of direct reimbursement for nurse anesthetists signified that the federal government recognized CRNAs were not only capable providers, but that they should be paid at similar levels to their physician counterparts when providing anesthesia and related services without supervision. Concomitant gains in federal education funding, $1.43 million, and improvements to Veterans Administration fee schedules rounded out what proved to be a very successful legislative start to the new decade. As has often been the case in our nation's capital, however, the certainty of these gains proved to be short-lived. In early February 1991, President Bush unveiled his budget for fiscal year 1992. The administration's hard line on taxes and domestic spending had meant budget cuts for Medicare of $3.2 billion in 1991, with yet another $2.9 billion cut proposed for the upcoming year. Furthermore, it projected total cuts of more than $25 billion over the next 5 years. Nearly $1 billion of that 5-year total would be obtained from cuts to anesthesia care, accomplished by establishing a single blanket fee for services. Factoring in the cuts to Medicare in 1992 alone, the resulting 2.6% budget increase would fall well below the projected rate of inflation at 4.3%. What this would mean for CRNAs and other non-physician practitioners became clear after the Physician Payment Review Commission, the PPRC, made its congressional report public in April of that year. In the report, the PPRC indicated that, in light of the aforementioned budget shortfall, it would not support the CRNA fee schedule as passed in the OBRA of 1990. What was more, the Commission suggested paying for anesthesia services in a manner irrespective of the makeup of the care team. Thus, according to their recommendation, the total fee paid for services provided by an anesthesia care team consisting of an anesthesiologist and a CRNA should not exceed the payment made to a solo anesthesiologist for the same service. In short, shifting to a single fee would adversely impact the earning potential of both CRNAs and anesthesiologists. Such a proposal would disincentivize hospitals from using care teams to which over 70% of CRNAs had arranged employment. Perhaps more compelling, it also had the potential to exacerbate the shortage of CRNAs, which already threatened access to anesthesia care throughout much of the nation. Predictably, the PPRC also balked at the notion that CRNAs should be compensated at levels near of their physician colleagues. Going a step further, without suggesting any difference in the quality of care provided, the PPRC asserted that CRNAs should be paid less per unit of time than anesthesiologists when administering care in order to reflect differences in investments in education and training. While the AANA conceded that reimbursement gains in the OBRA anticipated similar increases in anesthesiologist fee schedules, the association argued that the PPRC failed to take into consideration that anesthesiologists retained considerably greater earning potential through fees garnered from CRNA supervision. While the PPRC proposal would result in significant savings, research suggested that there were other means of attaining similar savings while increasing anesthesiologist productivity. A Center for Health Economics research study, published in the February 1990 issue of Medical Care, examined the impact of nurse anesthetists on anesthesiologist productivity and found that greater delegation of anesthesia care by the latter to the former would provide $500 million in savings annually. The study added that as anesthesiologists enjoy incomes of $140,000 compared with $40,000 for CRNAs, any failure to raise productivity through delegation has profound cost implications. Specifically, anesthesiologists who work in hospitals with CRNAs are 20% more productive on average than those working alone. Directly disputing findings by the Graduate Medical Education National Advisory Committee that called for 2,700 more anesthesiologists by 1990, the study suggested that $560 million could be saved annually by reducing the number of anesthesiologists and increasing their productivity through increased reliance on CRNAs. While Congress ultimately rejected the Bush administration's proposed cuts to Medicare in the 1992 OBRA budget resolution, Medicare fee schedules remained a point of contention going forward. The single fee proposal made by the PPRC would crop up again, as will be explored later in this chapter. In the meantime, another Medicare fee proposal made by the HCFA, the agency responsible for administering the Medicare program, brought renewed scrutiny upon CRNA gains achieved under the OBRA of 1990. This scrutiny would not be confined to CRNA reimbursement, however. The recommendations sent waves throughout the wider community of anesthesia providers, raising serious questions about access to and the affordability of anesthesia care. In particular, the HCFA recommended a 35% reduction in payments to anesthesiologists per service provided. Such a reduction would have brought anesthesiologist compensation below the payment self-directed CRNAs could have earned per the 1990 OBRA fee schedule. Conceding that CRNAs could not expect to earn more than their physician counterparts, the AANA agreed that payment reductions to anesthesia services on the whole would necessarily have to apply to CRNAs as well. Ultimately, however, Congress stepped in to override these proposed cuts. Public opinion toward the healthcare crisis was shifting, proving more consequential to legislators seeking re-election than currying favor with an embattled president. The proposed cuts to anesthesia services did not take effect, thereby preserving the modest gains CRNAs had obtained via the OBRA of 1990. While the grassroots mobilization of CRNAs had proven formidable, the systemic issues facing the American healthcare system continued to take their toll. Congressional committees and the federal agencies at the heart of this crisis continue to operate under the assumption that efficiency and hawkish budget oversight would ameliorate the crisis. It proved to be bad medicine. These decisions reverberated into the public sphere as growing public support for meaningful healthcare reform became more palpable. Yet, as concerned as Americans were about healthcare, a new crisis loomed on the horizon. Once again, CRNAs would be called to the front lines as a brief but destructive war broke out in the Persian Gulf. CRNAs and the Gulf War, 1990 to 1991. In many ways, the 57th annual meeting of the AANA in Atlanta, Georgia, played out much like its predecessors. Speeches were made, awards were given, and the latest developments in anesthesia were on display. Yet, amidst the celebration, recognition, and camaraderie that exemplified these gatherings, the outbreak of war in the Persian Gulf had become somewhat of an elephant in the room. Upwards of 50% of CRNAs in military service had been forced to cancel their plans to attend, while others, including AANA Director of Meeting Services Glenn C. Ramsborg, received orders to depart immediately while in attendance. Lorraine Jordan vividly recalled watching fellow CRNAs getting up and leaving the room in order to answer their call of duty. CRNAs have a long history of answering that call during wartime, having been counted on by the U.S. military to provide care on the front lines in every major conflict since World War I. Some have paid the ultimate price. Despite the valorous legacy of CRNAs in wartime, each conflict brought new challenges, and the Gulf War of 1990 to 91 was no exception. In a show of support for its members deployed overseas, the AANA affixed yellow ribbons to the doors of the AANA headquarters, publicly honoring those who had been deployed while encouraging members to correspond with deployed CRNAs as pen pals. AANA President David Fletcher, a veteran of 20 years in the service, utilized his January 1991 President's Message in the AANA News Bulletin to reach out to the deployed, expressing solidarity and confidence that they would provide quality care to our military members in their time of need, now as in the past. As noted by Major Leland H. Winger, CRNA, the lead-up to being activated was rather difficult for military CRNAs and their families. Viewed in hindsight, Operations Desert Storm and Desert Shield may appear trifling compared to larger-scale and prolonged conflicts in our nation's history. But it is important to remember that there was no indication this war would be short-lived at the time. Winger recalled the stress leading up to his deployment in early 1991, noting that you don't sleep well and are always on edge, not knowing for how long you and your loved ones would be separated. In addition to concerns over deployed members who might be placed in harm's way and the well-being of their families, the AANA would have been remiss not to acknowledge what the loss of so many CRNAs would mean for anesthesia services on the home front. For more than a decade, the AANA had been tackling a shortage of CRNAs brought on by declining enrollment and the closure of more than one-third of education programs across the country. Even before the conflict began, President Fletcher declared that demand for nurse anesthesia services had never been more acute. Now, Fletcher noted these shortages were further exacerbated by the calling of CRNAs to the front lines of Operations Desert Storm and Desert Shield. Additionally, an already overstretched CRNA education system would lose a number of students and faculty once activated. Only a few months into the conflict, these shortages were beginning to take their toll. Fortunately, many military hospitals could rely on recently retired military CRNAs, up to age 62, and CRNA military reservists who were mobilized to take the place of their active duty colleagues in statewide military hospitals. Civilian care centers were not so fortunate. Vulnerable populations, namely in medically underserved rural and inner-city areas, had come to rely on CRNAs for anesthesia services. For example, hospitals affiliated with the Indian Health Service were hit particularly hard, as were education programs that saw students and faculty called to active duty. Unsurprisingly, statewide CRNAs responded to these shortages with vigor. Recognizing the work that individual CRNAs were doing to offset this crisis, President Fletcher thanked members for filling this acute void by taking extra shifts and covering for the practices of their colleagues in rural areas. Reports from the front lines, meanwhile, suggested that CRNAs in service to their country were making do the best they could in light of the conditions they faced. Staff anesthetist Colonel Willis G. Bullard reported that most CRNAs were already in the field, with many on small bases in the middle of the desert, facing miserable living conditions. Commander James M. Timo, also a CRNA, concurred with Bullard's assessment, noting that CRNAs were coping with some very harsh living and working environments. Indeed, Lieutenant Commander Alexander Litwin, CRNA, recalled living in tents with sand floors, without showers, laundry facilities, or hot meals. All expense and effort were given to maintaining clean and sterile operating rooms, consisting of Makesh shelters, 10 feet by 20 feet by 8-foot steel boxes, where they received casualties, mostly Iraqis, many of whom were blast injuries with burns and shrapnel wounds. More than merely a standard of living concern, CRNAs had to be cognizant of the effect that extreme ground temperatures, as high as 130 degrees Fahrenheit, would have on the volatile anesthetics they worked with. Seeing as though normal concentrations of these anesthetics became lethal at temperatures of 120 degrees Fahrenheit, CRNAs were forced to adapt their method of delivery, in some cases borrowing techniques deployed by British forces already in country. Given the formidable task of assessing and assuring their unit's preparedness in the middle of a desert, Bullard declared his fellow CRNAs were doing a marvelous job, adapting to the situation as well as ensuring they had enough supplies and equipment to do the job. Like many conflicts before it, CRNAs performed the lion's share of anesthesia services in both Operation Desert Storm and Operation Desert Shield. According to a letter received from Commander Eugene Lujan in early February 1991, CRNAs such as himself had already performed over 100 anesthetics during their short time in Saudi Arabia. In fact, he reported that the very first anesthetic provided in Saudi Arabia, a subarachnoid block for an incarcerated hernia, had been performed by a CRNA. Similarly, the first anesthetic administered in Kuwait, a spinal for a Marine who had stepped on a cluster mine, was performed successfully by Lieutenant Corey Brimmer, CRNA. Brimmer noted that he and Lieutenant Edward Missakonis, CRNA, worked alongside two anesthesiologists during their time in Kuwait, adding that they had a great time working together and appreciated their support. In many cases, especially those close to the front lines, CRNAs were asked to perform as the sole anesthesia providers in their respective combat zones. Ronald B. Ostman, an Army CRNA, echoed these points, noting that during Desert Storm, I was the only anesthesia provider with my unit in support of special operations, adding that his unit was not the only one with CRNAs as the only anesthesia providers. Some who had been relied upon in conflict to provide much-needed medical services bristled when their abilities were questioned upon their return home. Ostman, in particular, took exception to what he perceived as slurs against his profession, noting that CRNAs were providing high levels of care without supervision in war zones, yet their ability to work without supervision was being questioned in civilian hospitals under far more favorable conditions. The AANA, for its part, tried to provide the recognition these brave men and women deserved by publishing their letters and reports of their heroism in the association's monthly newsletter and flagship journal. In addition to this published support of CRNAs in the field of duty and those mobilized on the home front, the AANA began marshaling its influence in Washington, D.C. on their behalf as well. Driven by the grassroots lobbying efforts of the AANA membership, Federal Government Affairs Director Michaels announced the success of the Dire Emergency Persian Gulf Desert Shield Storm Supplemental Authorization Act of 1991, which included authorization for special pay and benefits for CRNAs serving under reserve, recalled, or retained designations who had previously been denied this compensation. The AANA lobbied aggressively for extensions to those benefits to ensure that CRNAs serving their country were properly compensated throughout the course of the conflict. Following yet another grassroots campaign carried out by the membership, several members of the AANA, including President Fletcher, testified before the Senate Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, citing CRNA shortages and the importance of equitable pay and incentives to increase recruitment and retention of CRNAs in the armed forces. The extension became law in December 1991, formally extending special pay incentives to CRNAs and other healthcare providers in service to their country through September 1993. For even though the Gulf War had ended, CRNAs continued to serve in conflict zones such as Somalia and Croatia. Not content with these successes, the AANA lobbied for retroactive incentive pay dating back to the start of the conflict. The association was able to confirm in the April 1992 AANA News Bulletin that incentive pay would be retroactively applied from August 1990 onward. Renewed focus on CRNA pay within the military also lent itself to greater attention being paid to ensuring competitive pay for CRNAs serving in Department of Veterans Affairs (VA) hospitals. As the primary providers of care for half a century, more than 85% of anesthesia services provided in the VA were performed by nurse anesthetists. Through a joint effort of the AANA and the Association of Veterans Administration Nurse Anesthetists, AVANA, changes were proposed to help determine how competitive existing pay schedules were. The AANA and AVANA took issue with the existing methodology, noting that it often neglected to include incentives offered by group practice arrangements and contract agencies, such as bonuses. Thus, by building off of momentum to better incentivize military CRNAs, the AANA and AVANA were able to leverage increased attention on the compensation of CRNAs, working within the purview of the VA. According to then AVANA President Richard Briscoe, this development also reflected the growing synergy between the AANA and AVANA, particularly in joint activities aimed at improving the professional conditions experienced by all CRNAs. Thank you, ma'am, for what you did in Nam, the Vietnam Women's Memorial. Marching proudly behind a banner bearing the AANA logo, President Linda Callahan led a massive procession, including AANA executives, more than 50 CRNAs from around the country, and 10,000 total participants down a parade route lined by 35,000 onlookers present for the November 11, 1993 dedication of the Vietnam Women's Memorial. Nearly 30 years later, Vietnam veteran Jane McCarthy, CRNA, reflected on the parade of nurses down Constitution Avenue in her prepared remarks for the 2022 Memorial Day observance at the memorial. McCarthy recalled swelling with pride and holding back tears as she marched beside her fellow CRNAs, hearing the tributes bellowed by the veterans who lined the avenue. "You took care of me. Thanks for the gas. Welcome home. Without you, I wouldn't be here." And, "Yeah, we know who you are," were among the phrases heard by the CRNAs as they marched along. "This was so healing for all of us, for the vets and the nurses," McCarthy recalled. "Nurses had seen those atrocities day in and day out, and we needed to be healed." Sherry Fassett, CRNA, who was the AANA Public Relations Committee chair when she marched in the parade, remembered seeing one veteran amputee who sat straight up in his wheelchair and saluted with every ounce of honor and respect that he had as the procession passed by. Jack Hitchens, who drove down to the ceremony with as many CRNAs as he could stuff into his Buick station wagon, recalled the emotions on display when they arrived, especially a very influential CRNA by the name of Leon Helton, who was of the Vietnam era, breaking down in tears as he gazed upon the memorial. For the CRNAs who had served in the conflict, both in the military and as volunteers, the memorial was well-deserved recognition from their fellow veterans. For those who had not, it was a stirring reminder of the legacy and sacrifice made by CRNAs who came before them. Once referred to as the best-kept secret in healthcare, these women and men proudly marched in fulfillment of a moment many years in the making. At the memorial's dedication, in recognition of the long road the memorial had faced, U.S. Vice President Al Gore solemnly remarked, "Let's never again take so long in honoring a debt." Merely glossed over in the introduction to this volume, readers are encouraged to educate themselves as to the heroic efforts that CRNAs have made in nearly a century of armed conflict, as documented in Mary Ann Bankert's first volume of Watchful Care. The Vietnam War claimed the lives of two CRNAs, Jerome Edwin Olmsted and Kenneth R. Shoemaker, Jr., while leaving scars, physical, emotional, and spiritual, on the many more who proudly administered care during the conflict. Though dedicated to the women who served in the Vietnam War, the organization and its membership took the opportunity to honor both the men and women who provided care during the conflict. Originally conceived of by U.S. Army nurse Diane Carlson Evans in 1984, it took nearly a decade for the memorial to be realized. The AANA and its members had been vocal supporters of the Vietnam Women's Memorial from its conception to its dedication. CRNAs and the HIV/AIDS crisis during the early 1990s. While HIV and AIDS was by no means a new issue for healthcare professionals in the early 1990s, the number of people estimated to be living with HIV had grown from roughly 40,000 to more than 700,000 over the previous decade. Many of these cases were then undiagnosed and would require care for the first time during the 1990s. Caring for 750,000 people with HIV and AIDS was more than merely a logistical challenge for hospitals and healthcare professionals. Public hysteria, widespread misinformation, and even legitimate fears about transmission made HIV and AIDS a transformative care crisis worldwide. For nurses, including CRNAs, the issues of work-related exposure and growing public concerns about iatrogenic transmission as a result of treatment or care, became increasingly prevalent during the 1990s. With regard to work-related exposure, the CDC addressed these concerns through comprehensive guidelines for protecting healthcare providers and public safety workers from acquiring hepatitis B and HIV in June 1989. As of September 1988, the number of confirmed cases among healthcare providers was just over 3,000, with the vast majority of those cases attributed to high-risk behavior outside of their work in the field. The CDC identified 44 of the cases as being possible workplace infections, with 18 of them reportedly involving parenteral and/or other non-needle stick exposure to blood or other bodily fluids from patients. As of July 1988, the CDC was aware of approximately 1,200 healthcare providers enrolled and tested for HIV antibody in ongoing CDC surveillance after they were exposed via needle stick or splashes to skin or mucous membranes to blood from patients known to be HIV infected. While HIV diagnosis remained low among this group, roughly 4%, one can understand the concern shared by many in the industry. Meanwhile, the virus and its transmission in healthcare settings had received increasing attention in the national press. A myriad of stories, including a case of stolen AIDS-tainted needles, fears of HIV-positive doctors and nurses practicing, nurses becoming infected on the job, and reports that dentists had inadvertently infected patients, brought public concern to a fever pitch. Public calls for widespread testing of healthcare providers were rejected by medical organizations such as the AMA and ANA on both practical and financial grounds, as well as concerns that such testing amounted to an unwarranted invasion of privacy. At the same time, the AMA called for legislation to allow unrestricted diagnostic testing of suspected HIV patients without informed consent. As HIV is not feared today as deeply as it was at the time, it may be difficult to fully comprehend the controversy surrounding uninformed testing and disclosure. Many, both in the public and the healthcare industry, fear the ostracization and exclusion that accompanied the disease due to a regrettable tendency to blame the suffering of HIV victims on their own lifestyle choices. In the January 1988 issue of the AANA News Bulletin, President Mary Jeanette Menino pledged that the organization would do its utmost to protect both its membership and the high standard of care they provided. Menino stressed that the AANA needed to consider the health and safety issues of personnel, confidentiality, clinical anesthesiology implications, and ethical issues in its approach to the crisis. While stopping short of making an official pronouncement on the AANA's position, Menino applauded the AANA for its commitment to provide anonymous testing, support for informed consent, and opposition to mandatory testing of healthcare providers, while reaffirming a nurse's duty to provide care to any and all who needed it. In addition, the organization announced that Professor Sandra Lovell, a CRNA at the Medical College of Virginia, would provide a talk on trauma care and AIDS exposure at the 1988 AANA annual meeting in Seattle. Lovell noted that CRNAs working in trauma care often encountered patients who present with very little history, making it difficult to know whether that patient might be a carrier of AIDS or hepatitis. In 1989, the AANA HIV and AIDS Task Force drafted the organization's infection control guidelines for anesthesia, based on the best information available at the time. Even in those relatively early days, the AANA recognized the growing challenge that HIV and AIDS presented to clinical practice. As the crisis deepened in the early 1990s, the AANA took additional steps to ensure its members were informed and supported. It was announced in May 1990 that the closing session of that year's annual meeting in Atlanta would be dedicated to presenting opposing viewpoints on the hazards posed by treating patients with HIV. Recognizing the controversial nature of the topic, the organization thought it best to allow members to hear varying perspectives on the delicate balance between a duty to provide care and the need to protect healthcare providers. Meanwhile, AANA President Fletcher appointed a task force of CRNAs and staff to draft organizational guidelines for the prevention and management of HIV and AIDS for CRNAs. The task force was also charged with updating the AANA infection control guidelines for anesthesia to reflect advancements in HIV and AIDS research for the fiscal year 1992. The task force submitted their revisions to an epidemiologist a mere month later for review. Meanwhile, the AANA actively engaged the CDC and AMA at every opportunity on the issue. According to AANA Executive Director John F. Gard, the AANA quickly realized the importance of taking a leadership position on the issue of HIV and AIDS from the perspectives of both CRNAs and patients. AANA President Scott Gray echoed Gard's pronouncement, noting that the AANA was one of a mere handful of healthcare organizations that had developed its own field-specific guidelines for preventing HIV and AIDS transmission. Gray lamented the hysteria perpetuated by the media and lack of consensus among various nursing specialty groups on the issue of HIV and AIDS transmission, while promising the membership that the AANA would continue to monitor all activities concerning HIV and AIDS transmission. The organization remained highly involved in any and all opportunities to participate in this dialogue throughout 1991. While the AANA drafted and revised guidelines to protect both CRNAs and their prospective patients from transmission, the organization also made its presence felt on the issue of mandatory testing and informed consent. Growing fears among the public inspired a wave of, in many cases, reactionary congressional activity. On June 26, 1991, Representative William Dannemeyer, Republican from California, introduced House Resolution 2788, or the Kimberly-Burgales Patient and Health Provider Protection Act of 1991. The proposed legislation was inspired by the first known case of iatrogenic transmission of HIV and AIDS from a medical procedure, in this case, a dental procedure. Burgales courageously outed herself as the first of 5 patients to have contracted the virus after having their teeth worked on by Dr. David Acer, spending her remaining days advocating for the mandatory testing and disclosure of medical professionals' HIV and AIDS status. While the AANA was deeply sympathetic to those who had contracted the disease in the healthcare setting, the organization encouraged key senators to vote against any and all legislation that included a mandatory testing and disclosure provision until the CDC provided its guidance on the matter. Having endeavored to keep up with the latest developments in HIV and AIDS research, the AANA was confident that the Acer case would prove to be an anomaly and that mandatory testing represented an unnecessary invasion of privacy for healthcare providers. Moreover, the association concurred with the congressional testimony of Barbara Fassbinder, a former nurse who contracted HIV when exposed to tainted blood during emergency attempts to save a patient's life. Fassbinder suggested that testing was not instant or perfect in its reliability and would lead to a false sense of security that could not replace good techniques and strict use of barrier precautions. With regard to the danger of provider-to-patient transmission, the AANA proved to be correct. Cases of provider-to-patient transmission of HIV remain statistically insignificant to this day. The case of Dr. Acer and the patients he likely infected through dental procedures remains a medical mystery. Having helped to derail expensive, ineffective, and unnecessarily invasive legislation that would have potentially subjected CRNAs to mandatory testing and disclosure of infection status, the AANA dedicated itself to continuing to provide support and education for all nurse anesthetists, beginning with educating members on the nuances of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration's (OSHA) newly released bloodborne pathogen standards. The AANA put together a workshop for the 1992 Spring Assembly of States in Chicago. In cooperation with the leadership of state associations of nurse anesthetists, SANAs, the AANA guidelines on HIV and AIDS prevention and management for the certified registered nurse anesthetist were discussed in depth. In addition, lengthy discussions took place on HIV and AIDS epidemiology and how changes in CRNA practice could minimize risk and promote proper infection control in the delivery of anesthesia. Meanwhile, the organization continued to publish educational materials, including an in-depth discussion on transmission in a full-page article dedicated to an address by noted HIV and AIDS epidemiologist Robert L. Murphy, M.D. Attendees of the 1993 AANA annual meeting in San Francisco witnessed a full-day program on bloodborne diseases with an emphasis on protection guidelines to prevent the clinical transmission of HIV and AIDS and hepatitis B. In order to ensure all questions were answered, the program was followed by a lengthy question and answer period with the day's speakers as well as members of the AANA HIV/AIDS Task Force. During a period of hysteria and misinformation, the AANA endeavored to ensure that CRNAs had access to the most up-to-date information and precautionary measures in order that they may continue to provide high-quality care while protecting themselves and their patients. Noting a gap in coverage for healthcare providers infected with HIV in the workplace, as traditional insurance plans offered no benefits for seropositivity alone, the AANA sponsored an HIV indemnity plan for CRNAs that paid out a $250,000 lump sum upon infection. The plan also specified that any abnormalities detected in the blood would be confidential and would only be disclosed to the applicant's personal physician. The AANA hoped a lump sum would help the CRNA financially, enabling them to decide how best to proceed for themselves and loved ones without being overly influenced by economic factors. Though proud to offer this plan to its membership, the AANA lamented in the January 1993 AANA News Bulletin that the first call they received to the association's toll-free 800 number was from an anonymous CRNA who confided they wished the plan had been available earlier as they had been infected just 6 months prior. Part and parcel with providing health care, HIV and AIDS continues to be a risk to providers. That said, education, awareness, and safer practice procedures have been implemented that have greatly reduced the risk to CRNAs without invasive, privacy-threatening measures. The AANA is proud of the role it played in bringing education and awareness to its members while advocating for their medical rights and privacy. CRNAs, on the whole, never lost sight of their responsibility to provide high-quality care to every patient, regardless of their status or medical history. Once again, nurse anesthetists performed admirably, and through the support of their state and national associations, were able to navigate this difficult period with the grace and professionalism their patients and colleagues had learned to count on. Nurse anesthesia and the push for healthcare reform, 1992 to 1996. As military CRNAs were welcomed back following the Gulf War's conclusion, public pressure for meaningful healthcare reform was mounting. With 35 million Americans not having insurance and scores more unhappy with the cost of coverage they had, it proved to be one of the most consequential voting issues in the 1992 presidential election. In a strange turn of events, it was also the first time many Americans heard the term nurse anesthetist. Democratic presidential nominee Bill Clinton campaigned extensively on the promise of meaningful health care, utilizing his mother's experience as a nurse anesthetist to evince credibility with healthcare workers. Newspapers across the country mentioned Virginia Kelly's 35-year career as a nurse anesthetist, giving the field some much-deserved publicity and recognition. Indeed, the New York Times alone published 4 articles mentioning her career as a CRNA in the months leading up to the November 1992 election. The AANA would attempt to leverage this opportunity in order to gain more meaningful access to the Clinton administration. Access did not always translate to influence, however, as the new administration's healthcare reforms ended up being a bit of a mixed bag for CRNAs. If 1992 was the first time that many Americans became acquainted with nurse anesthetists who had been quietly performing a significant portion of the nation's anesthesia care for the last century, it might have also been the first time a fair number of them heard the term managed care as well. In reality, managed care is simply an umbrella term for health insurance systems designed to leverage access to a group of prospective patients in exchange for competitive pricing. Managed care had its origins in the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when unions, fraternal orders, and various community groups made exclusive arrangements with physicians to provide prepaid medical care for their members. Then and now, managed care is effective in reducing costs for healthy populations, but through short-sighted, business-oriented practices that are not always conducive to promoting health. In that studies suggested more than 90% of the American population would be enrolled in some form of managed care program by the year 2000, the AANA thought it imperative to survey its members regarding their experience with those plans. Of particular interest to the profession was whether any HMOs, PPOs, or other plans refused to pay claims in which anesthesia was administered by CRNAs. The survey was part of the AANA's close monitoring of this rapidly evolving healthcare environment. The AANA Practice Committee, in particular, hoped to ascertain the potential effect this type of service may have on nurse anesthesia practice, in order that it might develop initiatives to address these issues. The Clinton administration's emphasis on reducing healthcare expenditures through competition between managed healthcare providers encouraged other cost-cutting measures to be revisited, including the 1991 PPRC's Anesthesia Care Team, ACT, single fee proposal. Again, this proposal meant that the total fee paid by Medicare for services performed by an ACT should not exceed the payment made for the same procedure provided by a solo anesthesiologist. At the time of its proposal, anesthesia services performed by an ACT, in this case an anesthesiologist supervising a single CRNA, were capped at 140% of the fee for a single anesthesiologist performing the same service. Thus, this proposal would eventually result in a 29% decrease in payment to the aforementioned care team. It was a tempting proposal for President Clinton, as his administration's budget proposal estimated it would save $100 million in 1993 alone and close to $1 billion over the following 5 years. As is always the case, price tags and savings do not tell the whole story. On January 15, 1993, AANA President Peggy McFadden provided both oral and written testimony before the PPRC regarding the association's position on the single-fee proposal. In the interest of both education and full transparency, McFadden utilized her president's message in the May 1993 AANA News Bulletin to go over the nuances of the AANA's position and share the association's plan of action with its membership. The AANA, for its part, conceded that reform was necessary, but that the current proposal did not address what the AANA perceived as the greater issue: the cost associated with CRNA shortages and concomitant overutilization of anesthesiologists for services CRNAs were more than capable of performing without supervision. Moreover, the AANA held that the single-fee proposal, as presented, would cause undue disruption in practice arrangements by incentivizing discrimination against CRNAs and other non-physician providers, by preventing equitable access to clinical opportunities. Furthermore, the AANA argued that reductions to payments obtained through CRNA employee services would cause hospitals to take a long look at the cost-benefit of maintaining accredited nurse anesthesia education programs within their facilities. The association maintained that any reduction in educational opportunities, whether by closure or reticence in establishing new programs, would have a disastrous impact on a healthcare system already burdened by pronounced shortages of CRNAs. The AANA was not alone in providing testimony, as the ASA delivered both oral and written remarks as well. Surprisingly, the ASA appeared willing to risk potential earnings shortfalls as long as the anesthesiologists did not shoulder a disproportionate share of the economic burden, and no additional demands were made regarding the nature of anesthesiologist direction. Tellingly, the ASA objected to a proposed strengthening of provisions regulating physician supervision contained in the TEFRA rules that had been adopted in 1982. Under the PPRC proposal, TEFRA would be revised to mandate greater physician involvement in anesthesia care services billed by teams under their supervision, including requiring the anesthesiologist's physical presence at prescribed time intervals. Thus, the ASA's official position was to accept the PPRC proposal on the conditions that TEFRA would be left unchanged and ACT fees would be set at 120% of the cap for a single provider as opposed to 100%. The AANA also opposed the proposed changes to TEFRA. It had long been the AANA's position that CRNAs were perfectly capable of providing anesthesia services in the absence of physician supervision, and that CRNAs themselves should decide whether they wish to work in care teams or practice independently. Thus, the AANA was not merely concerned that the proposed changes to TEFRA would disincentivize anesthesiologists from utilizing CRNAs. The association was also leery of these requirements being interpreted as a minimum quality of care standard. To reiterate, the AANA's position to the PPRC recommendations was rooted in the fact that there was a better solution. Research had shown that loosening supervision requirements, rather than tightening them, would provide hospitals the flexibility to more efficiently utilize cost-effective and equally safe CRNAs in ratios of supervision that would keep high standards of care in balance with the need for fiscal reform and ever-diminishing budgets. The revival of the PPRC single-fee proposal further strained the AANA-ASA relations. Charges by the ASA that the AANA sought to destroy anesthesia care teams and eliminate supervision requirements were only partially true, according to AANA President McFadden. After all, upwards of 70% of CRNAs practiced in ACTs at that time. While the AANA did object to supervision requirements on principle, the lion's share of the organization's objection to the PPRC proposal was that it would disincentivize anesthesiologists and hospitals from utilizing ACTs. The AANA strove to provide CRNAs with professional opportunities, not eliminate them. President McFadden lamented the ASA's disinclination to focus on the common ground in each organization's position on this proposal. The PPRC delivered its annual report to Congress on March 31st, containing a chapter dedicated to its single-fee proposal titled Payment for the Anesthesia Care Team. Sticking to its guns, the PPRC recommended that an immediate cap of 120% be placed on ACT services, with a staggered 5% annual reduction over 4 years. The end result would be a 1-to-1 payment ratio, irrespective of the number of providers involved. The AANA projected that such a reduction would reduce the hourly earning potential of medically directed CRNAs working under a 50-50 split, while in reality, CRNAs might have been asked to accept less in order to incentivize anesthesiologists to consider such an arrangement. On the bright side, the PPRC suggested that the HCFA should review the supervision requirements made under TEFRA. In addition, the 50-50 split, even after the reductions, was considered a small victory by the AANA. Should the provisions of supervision under TEFRA be loosened, CRNAs would be more able to work independently or in supervisor-to-provider ratios that would allow for more equitable fee splitting with an anesthesiologist. Should the HCFA eliminate physician supervision requirements under TEFRA and Medicare entirely, CRNAs would be able to compete in a more equitable marketplace for their services, eliminating the artificial demand for anesthesiologists entirely. In so many words, the loosening or elimination of these supervision requirements would afford CRNAs diverse opportunities in the healthcare marketplace where they could engage in merit-based competition for their services. In such a marketplace, the AANA liked the CRNA's odds. In light of the PPRC's report, the AANA shifted tactics. Having arranged a meeting with the Clinton administration's health task force, the AANA pointed to the anti-competitive barriers under the restrictions imposed by TEFRA and issues with physician-friendly HMOs and PPOs restricting CRNA's clinical privileges. TEFRA's rigid supervision requirements imposed arbitrarily low ratios of supervisor to provider in ACTs that artificially inflated the demand for anesthesiologists. Combined with discriminatory practices by some managed care organizations, the AANA held that these barriers inflated healthcare costs to hospitals, the federal government, and the American taxpayer. Along these lines, McFadden reminded administration officials of the potential savings that greater utilization of CRNAs would generate. McFadden cited a study conducted by CRNA Ira P. Gunn that demonstrated 10 CRNAs could be educated for the same cost to the federal government as one anesthesiologist. While a productive meeting, no immediate policy changes were forthcoming. However, in hindsight, future HCFA proposed regulations, 1997, appear to have taken cues from the AANA's position on these issues. In spite of the efforts of the AANA and its membership on January 1, 1994, the payment for an ACT became fixed at 120% of what a solo anesthesiologist would have paid for the procedure alone, and as originally proposed by the PPRC, the payment would be reduced 5% every year until 1998 when it reached 100%. Meanwhile, the AANA took advantage of another opportunity to get some face time with President Clinton during the festivities surrounding National Nurses Week in early May 1993. Several high-ranking AANA officials, including President-elect Linda Callahan, were on hand as President Clinton emphasized the important role CRNAs would be allowed to play in his vision for the nation's healthcare system. Away from the cameras and spectacle, Callahan stressed to the president's policy assistant, Ira Magaziner, the role of anti-competitive barriers in preventing CRNAs from having a fair playing field in the marketplace. The response was favorable, as Magaziner noted the president had his eye on regulations at both the state and federal levels that artificially restricted the scope of practice of American nurses. The president and his staff expressed optimism that these policy items could be folded into their pursuit of high-quality, inclusive, and less expensive care for all Americans. For all the optimism surrounding healthcare reform, there were practical concerns as well. A post-convention meeting of the AANA Board of Directors was held in late 1993 to discuss what healthcare reform would mean for practicing CRNAs. The first order of business was to select a panel of experts from within and outside the organization. This panel would analyze potential opportunities and complications presented by proposed changes to the healthcare marketplace. The panel identified 4 primary areas of focus to begin their investigations. First among them was how reform would likely lead to an array of integrations and mergers, both vertical among non-competitors and horizontal among competitors, within the healthcare system, and what impact this would have on CRNA practice arrangements. Second, seeing as though President Clinton figured managed care plans would be essential to lowering the cost of healthcare, the panel thought it wise to study the viability of CRNAs within various types of health payment plans, HMOs and PPOs, for example. Third, as more and more healthcare providers opted to form managed care groups, the panel thought it best to explore how CRNA's participation in and/or exclusion from these groups would play out in legal and economic terms. Lastly, the panel recommended a cost-benefit analysis survey to determine the viability of CRNAs leaving salaried positions to sign managed care contracts. Following the completion of this first phase of investigations, the AANA would initiate a second phase in which CRNAs and AANA executives would evaluate the panel's findings and draft position statements on these and other issues. At the core of the AANA's efforts was the attempt to ensure that CRNAs were adequately and separately reimbursed by managed care plans, regardless of whether they provided anesthesia services as the member of a team or individually. Callahan, who was now the AANA president, acknowledged that the task facing the association was daunting. As all 50 states were considering unique healthcare reform legislation, Callahan conceded that attempting to influence 50 state legislatures is awesome in scope and probably not realistic at the AANA national level. More than ever before, SANAs would be the key to protecting the integrity of CRNAs in the field by influencing their respective state legislative bodies. As integral as these battles would be in the 1990s, they would also lay the groundwork for the front lines of CRNA legitimacy and autonomy in the coming millennium. As 1994 began, the 103rd Congress returned to the nation's capital, and President Clinton gave his State of the Union address with a heavy heart. Just short of 3 weeks prior, the president's mother, nurse anesthetist Virginia Kelly, had passed away. And 3 days prior to Kelly's passing, Tip O'Neill, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives and a staunch advocate for universal health care reform, had died from cardiac arrest. It was fitting then that so much of the president's 63-minute speech was dedicated to health care reform. While acceding to the need for sweeping reform, the AANA looked cautiously through the myriad of bills and propositions to ensure that its membership was adequately represented in this potentially historic moment. Chief among the organization's concerns were the need to maintain direct reimbursement that was fair, preserving funding for graduate nursing education, eliminate barriers to equitable clinical privileges for CRNAs, and defend existing antitrust legislation. On March 21, 1994, the AANA sent a letter to the entire 103rd Congress highlighting these issues. While the AANA pledged to work with all sponsors of major healthcare reform bills, the organization identified President Clinton's Health Security Act as being the most favorable to CRNAs. In the April 1994 issue of the AANA News Bulletin, the association called on CRNAs to follow up on this letter by lobbying their respective representatives on the 4 areas of concern. Early results of CRNA lobbying efforts appeared fruitful. On June 15, 1994, the AANA was one of 5 groups asked to testify as to the danger of weakening antitrust laws in the healthcare reform process. Around the same time, Representative Mike Kreidler, Democrat from Washington, and 9 bipartisan co-sponsors introduced House Resolution 4291, a bill that the AANA informed CRNAs would remove Medicare barriers to your practice. Specifically, the AANA identified 3 barriers to equitable CRNA practice inherent in Medicare legislation: the rules pertaining to medical direction by anesthesiologists, TEFRA, the physician supervision conditions of participation, and payment issues for procedures performed by a CRNA in conjunction with an anesthesiologist. A companion bill in the Senate, 2310, was introduced by Senator Kent Conrad, Democrat from North Dakota, on July 21, 1994. As both bills reached their representative subcommittees, the AANA received word that Representative Kreidler had requested the AANA and the ASA to meet and discuss an accord that would facilitate a smoother legislative process. Eager to cooperate in the interest of facilitating quality care in a manner that best served its members, the AANA met with the ASA and a handful of legislators in Washington, D.C. to hammer out the details. A flurry of healthcare legislative activity consumed the nation's capital that summer, leading to seemingly never-ending calls for action. Seeing as though widespread healthcare reform presented both opportunity and peril for CRNA practice, the AANA, its membership, and their supporters needed to expend more resources than ever to ensure the strength of the profession going forward. Not since the drive for direct reimbursement under Medicare Part B had the organization been stretched so thin. And as was the case in the late 1980s, CRNAs went above and beyond in their support of the cause. By the fall of 1994, a clearer picture of how healthcare reform legislation would address the AANA's 4 main areas of concern emerged. Of the 5 major committees responsible for crafting healthcare reform bills, 4 had produced working bills for both houses of Congress to consider. All 4 bills would cover fees for CRNA services and made no preferential designation for either anesthesiologists or CRNAs as essential community providers. Of the 4 committees, 3 had jurisdiction over Medicare. While all 4 bills contained anti-discrimination language protecting CRNAs, regrettably, the 3 committees with Medicare jurisdiction opted not to include the AANA's Medicare barriers to CRNA practice language. However, in what AANA's experts chalked up as a victory, none of the 4 bills stood to weaken antitrust laws or their protections afforded by judicial precedent. Lastly, 3 of the 4 committees offered bills that included funding for graduate nurse education. Thus, while not addressing Medicare barriers, the bills otherwise looked favorable regarding CRNA practice and education. The AANA and its members and its supporters had done their part. Now it was up to Congress and the President to make healthcare reform a reality. Unfortunately, a congressional shakeup after the midterm election in 1994 brought the Clinton administration's healthcare reform package to a screeching halt. Both the House of Representatives and the Senate would possess Republican majorities in a stunning rebuke to President Clinton's first 2 years in office. The Contract with America platform that Republicans rode successfully into office called for reductions to social welfare programs, such as welfare in the interest of fiscal and personal responsibility, significant increases in defense spending, and a reduction in tax penalties against wealthy seniors and married couples, all while promising a balanced budget. While the contract did not specifically mention healthcare reform, precedent suggested that healthcare spending would be cut to offset defense spending and tax reductions. Feeling pressure from the midterm fallout, President Clinton signaled that he would be tougher on the skyrocketing costs of both Medicare and Medicaid. The AANA, for its part, lobbied and testified in strict opposition to any proposed cuts, however futile it might have seemed at the time. In her President's message in the February 1995 AANA News Bulletin, President Mary DePaula Lutzow expressed a sense of disbelief that likely resonated with many of her fellow CRNAs, noting that when taking office, she expected that 1995 would be a year of implementation of a new national health care plan. DePaula Lutzow found herself frustrated by the failure of that last year's Congress to enact meaningful reform. Though Republican support for it was lukewarm at best, DePaula Lutzow reminded her fellow members that polls suggested a whopping 70% of Americans still favored major changes in health care. In a rousing call to arms, the AANA president encouraged members to get involved and speak out. And so, yet again, CRNAs found themselves called upon to make their voices heard in a way that had become all too familiar to them, a grassroots mailing campaign. For though the AANA was extremely successful in adding CRNA-friendly language and provisions to a number of legislative bills in the previous year, the demise of healthcare reform in late 1994 effectively undermined many of those accomplishments. Moreover, while antitrust reform was not specifically mentioned in the Contract with America, the AANA expected the 104th Congress to weaken existing antitrust protections for CRNAs within the first 100 days. Thus, while progress was made and CRNA efforts left an indelible mark during President Clinton's first term in office, the harsh reality of Washington politics reared its ugly head once again. But as before, CRNAs continued their relentless campaign for fair pay, equal access, and legitimacy undaunted. Unbeknownst to them and their national association, a far greater fight awaited them in the final years of the millennium. An unexpected ruling by the HCFA in 1997 would prove to be a turning point for nurse anesthesia. It also heralded a return to bitter interorganizational fighting as the anti-CRNA forces would once again threaten the sovereignty of the profession. CRNA education in the 1990s. A workforce study in the July 1991 issue of Medical Care cited that decreasing CRNA to anesthesiologist ratios meant the delivery of anesthesia services in the United States is at a crossroads. Further, the study noted that 2 decades prior, the number of CRNAs exceeded anesthesiologists by a ratio of 2 to 1. Since that time, that ratio had decreased to 1.2 to 1 and was projected to fall even further by the year 2000. Thus, the study found that an increasing number of anesthesiologists were occupying positions previously dominated by their less expensive and equally reliable counterparts. At a time when congressional budget cuts were deemed expedient, the study predicted that a failure to adequately fund CRNA education might ultimately cost the American taxpayer between $750 million and $1.2 billion annually. Understanding the grave position into which nurse anesthesia education had fallen, in 1988 the AANA moved to fill the position of Director of Education and Research, vacant since 1983, by hiring Lorraine Jordan, CRNA. With the need for CRNAs at a critical level, Jordan recalled testifying to a congressional committee chaired by Senator Inouye, which ultimately led to a federally funded supply and demand study of CRNAs. Findings from this study noted a shortage of 6,000 CRNAs for 1990, a shortfall of 13.6%. This led to additional federal funding to support nurse anesthesia education programs. In 1989, CRNA Betty Horton was brought on as Director of Accreditation and eventually assumed the position of Director of Education in 1996, so that Jordan could devote herself fully to the increasingly vital research role of the AANA Foundation. While these hirings were an important step in addressing the CRNA shortage issue, it became clear that more needed to be done. CRNA matriculation in 1989 had dropped to roughly 40% of what was needed merely to offset retirements, never mind address the growing shortage. Having witnessed how declining funding had undermined CRNA education, the ASA was looking to assert more control over the nurse anesthesia education programs, with the ultimate goal of eliminating a now weakened competitor in the healthcare marketplace. Ever since CRNAs had earned direct reimbursement from Medicare B, the ASA had been keen to do anything in its power to reduce and/or eliminate CRNA education programs. For this reason, Richard Ouellette, in his second term as AANA president, sought to create a multidisciplinary commission comprised of CRNAs, anesthesiologists, hospital administrators, deans, and a healthcare economist to address the shortfall and shore up CRNA education programs in order to avoid a would-be takeover. The National Commission on Nurse Anesthesia Education, NCNAE, came into existence to address the AANA's overarching concern heading into the 1990s, increasing programs, enrollment, and matriculation in nurse anesthetist education. As lobbyist Deborah Hardy Havens noted while lobbying on behalf of the NCNAE in 1991, prior to that point, most if not all nurse anesthesia education programs were hospital-based. Declining budgets at many hospitals brought additional challenges. Where they had once received monthly stipends, prospective CRNAs were now being asked to pay tuition. What was more, those nurse anesthesia programs that existed within academic settings were often housed in departments other than nursing, for example, pharmacology, physiology, and more. Hardy Havens observed that this was a distinction that meant these programs were not eligible to receive any federal funds from the Nurse Training Act. A lack of professional solidarity between nurses and nurse anesthetists prior to the 1980s meant there was little reason for organized nursing to address this funding bias. An attempt to correct this was made within an amendments package in 1979, but the legislation could not escape the unforgiving eye of the deficit hawks in the Reagan administration. A modicum of funding was ultimately provided, but it fell well below what was needed. Programs and enrollment in nurse anesthesia had declined precipitously over the previous 10 years as a direct result. In its inaugural report, the NCNAE and its chair, Sandra Marie Ouellette, CRNA, recommended 8 goals to address the plight of CRNA education. First, the Commission recommended that the number of annual graduates be increased through the expansion of current programs and the development of new ones. Second, the Commission called for the creation of a recruitment and placement service for prospective CRNA faculty. Part of this initiative was to make CRNA education more attractive as a career path. Third, the Commission perceived a direct correlation between student recruitment and the equitable treatment and reimbursement of CRNAs currently in practice. For their fourth and fifth goals, the Commission recommended more focus on leadership training and collaboration between CRNAs and anesthesiologists to enhance anesthesia education. The remaining goals focused on marketing, funding, and staffing for these initiatives. Without mincing words, the Commission argued it was essential that the AANA immediately begin to acquire the manpower and material resources needed to implement those strategies essential to the achievement of these goals. In response to the Commission's report, the AANA Board of Directors appointed a Commission Implementation Task Force, consisting of CRNA members of the Commission, as well as a project team led by Jordan and CRNAs Kathy Mastropietro, Lois Frells, and Nancy Lindauer, to implement the recommendations. Following the completion of the 3-year project, the COA and the AANA Education Committee assumed responsibility for promoting the development of new nurse anesthesia education programs. Through these collective efforts, the supply of CRNAs markedly increased throughout the remainder of the decade. Persuasive lobbying by the AANA began to pay dividends as congressional appropriations for nurse anesthetist education began to trickle in. The increases were modest, barely keeping up with the annual cost increases. As time went on, however, more significant increases passed through Congress. Returns were realized almost immediately. 4 new schools were opened and accredited in 1990: Raleigh School of Nurse Anesthesia, University of North Carolina, Greensboro, United Hospital Center, School of Anesthesia, LaRoche College, Altoona Hospital School of Anesthesia for Nurses, and Oakland University, Beaumont Graduate Program of Nurse Anesthesia. In addition, numerous programs were expanded over the following decade, in some cases increasing enrollment by as much as 200% by the millennium. It must also be said that these efforts benefited greatly from the proliferation of new clinical sites whose administrators were willing to support the new programs. Without their support, these gains would not have been possible. In addition to opening new programs and expanding existing ones, the AANA's Commission Implementation Task Force and its project team, with the funding from the AANA Education and Research Foundation, began work on a learning center in the association's new, expanded headquarters. When completed, the center would be a cornerstone of the AANA's home office, providing education courses for CRNAs and opportunities for faculty development through the use of state-of-the-art equipment. As a part of this swell of interest and investment in CRNA education, the AANA kicked off a capital campaign for education to offset proposed funding cuts made by the Clinton administration. The campaign was aimed at buttressing nurse anesthesia education to broaden practice opportunities for CRNAs, with special attention given to advanced degree and leadership programs. A grassroots funding campaign was launched in February 1994 in hopes of raising $250,000 by November of that year. In addition, the AANA called upon CRNAs to lend their support to a grassroots campaign against proposed reductions in the Nurse Education Act, NEA. While the Clinton administration had overseen a near doubling of Title VIII NEA funding from just over $1 million to $2.75 million, in order to offset costly CRNA shortages, the AANA maintained that $4 million per year would be required. Under pressure to balance the budget, the Clinton administration proposed a $4 million cut to Title VIII's newly consolidated fund. While it was not expressly clear if nurse anesthesia education funds would be affected, it certainly meant that an increase in funding was extremely likely. Meanwhile, AANA education funds, earmarked in larger funding packages, were caught in the veritable crossfire as Congress looked for any and all means to cut spending that did not align with the contract with America. And while CRNA education funding was not expressly targeted for budget cuts in the fiscal 1996 budget, the message from Capitol Hill was that future growth of the NEA would be curtailed in the interest of fiscal responsibility. Though President Clinton exercised his veto power to prevent the Senate from rescinding previous funding for a myriad of programs, including $4 billion for the NEA, the message was clear. Nurse anesthesia education, while buoyed by funding increases in the early to mid-1990s, would face leaner times ahead. Though traditional line-item funding increases for the NEA may have been imperiled, the AANA had reasons to feel optimistic. Asked to weigh in on the difficulties many CRNA education programs had in obtaining funding from the Medicare Nursing and Allied Health Program, Also known as the Education Pass-Through, the PPRC recommended that the program be restructured so that all advanced degree nursing programs be eligible. At the time, only 1/3 of nurse anesthesia education programs qualified for pass-through, making such a recommendation integral to the health of CRNA education. While no immediate action followed the PPRC's recommendation, it nevertheless represented an acknowledgment of the legitimacy and import of CRNA education within the nation's healthcare system. MANA versus Allina Health Systems Corporation and others. When CRNAs were granted direct reimbursement under Medicare Part B, it posed a grave threat to those who aligned themselves against the interests of nurse anesthesia. Some anesthesiologists who had been reaping the benefits of outrageous supervision ratios, in some cases billing for the supervision of as many as 20 CRNAs, understood that their ill-gotten gains could not be maintained unless anti-competitive practices and, in some cases, outright billing fraud were committed. After direct reimbursement for CRNAs was achieved, a situation arose in Minnesota wherein CRNAs began receiving denials for services on account of double billing. After some digging, it became apparent that anesthesiologists were billing Medicare for services performed by CRNAs. According to former Minnesota Association of Nurse Anesthetists, MANA, President Gail Crabtree Pergolese, the denials suggested that some anesthesiologists prior to nurse anesthetists achieving direct reimbursement had made a practice of submitting bills to maximize revenue regardless of their actual participation in the delivery of anesthesia services. Only after CRNAs could bill directly under Medicare Part B did this become apparent. Allegedly, several anesthesiologists billed for services when they weren't even in the state at the time. While not all anesthesiologists were party to these activities, litigation filed by MANA revealed that there was a sufficient number who were taking part. When confronted by hospital administrators, the solution offered by several anesthesiologist groups was for the hospitals to simply fire the CRNAs in their employment so the anesthesiologist groups could employ the CRNAs themselves. In so many words, these groups sought to solve the problem by circumventing the new direct reimbursement rules for CRNAs and returning to the previous billing arrangement. This would only have been possible by having the CRNAs in their employment so they could control all of the anesthesia billing. Some CRNAs, especially those who had been working for anesthesiologists, did not oppose this proposal. Former AANA President Brian Thorson, who has also served as president of MANA, remembers these CRNAs making justifications for not opposing the anesthesiologists, such as it was all a misunderstanding or that the anesthesiologists were good people and nothing would be gained from fighting with them. At the same time, many CRNAs understood what was at stake and had no interest in losing gains made at the federal level. Others objected on principle, understanding that watchful care goes beyond anesthesia services to include being a steward for the profession, the financial well-being of patients, and the government programs that paid CRNAs for their services. Former AANA President Dennis Bless from Minnesota recalls discussions amongst MANA members and leadership that anesthesiologists are defrauding our patients and the American public, and we just can't sit by. Not all CRNAs saw it that way, however. Bless witnessed the division this incident created within the CRNA community in Minnesota and beyond, noting that anesthesiologists exploited these divisions to their advantage and began actively pitting CRNAs against CRNAs. The divide this created among some CRNAs is one that Bless believes exists to this day. Following an unusual spree of Medicare rejections for anesthesia services at Allina's Unity Hospital in Fridley, Minnesota, LaDonna Sue Schweer was tasked by the hospital with investigating it. While CRNAs such as Schweer and those she supervised typically worked for hospitals, anesthesiologists in the area were often employed by physician groups. What Schweer discovered was that among said anesthesiologists, several were billing Medicare for services performed by CRNAs. When Schweer and fellow CRNA Gail McKay spoke about the alleged fraud they had discovered, both found themselves blackballed in the greater Twin Cities metro area. According to Bless, both CRNAs were ideal targets because they were on the MANA board and had inside access to our strategies and attorneys. With the help of MANA and funded in large part by donations from CRNAs across the country, Schweer and McKay brought a lawsuit against 65 anesthesiologists, 5 hospitals, and their attorney and their billing agent, alleging that they were anti-competitively excluded from the market for acting as whistleblowers. Ultimately, due to a legal technicality involving indemnification clauses, the lawsuit was filed against Allina Health Systems. After a long and arduous legislative battle that spanned the better part of 2 decades, the courts ultimately found in favor of MANA, Schweer, McKay, and all other named plaintiffs. The decision was a major victory for CRNAs everywhere. Unfortunately, MANA, Schweer, and McKay would find themselves in court again, this time as adversaries in a dispute over the proper compensation the CRNA whistleblowers were owed. When originally agreeing to take part in the lawsuit, both were advised by their respective attorneys to seek out contracts from MANA, ensuring compensation from any possible settlement. According to Bless, it was not that Schweer and McKay's fellow MANA members felt they did not deserve compensation. It was that said compensation would have jeopardized MANA's standing as a 503b nonprofit and was, therefore, simply not in the association's best interest. Ultimately, the courts decided that MANA was obliged to pay out the contracts to Schweer and McKay. Ultimately, the lawsuit and its aftermath proved incredibly consequential for CRNAs and the field. The immediate impact of the lawsuit was the stark realization by many that TEFRA and the 7 conditions of participation were difficult, if not impossible, to enforce. Indeed, this had been the AANA's position for some time, with the association vigorously insisting to the HCFA and its successor organization, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, that the TEFRA rules are unneeded, unnecessarily restrictive, and unlikely to be followed. But MANA's lawsuit, in a sense, forced the AANA to reframe its argument. TEFRA either had to be followed to a T, or the policy needed to be changed. At the same time, the HCFA, having realized that it had been paying double for anesthesia services, began to consider paying CRNAs and anesthesiologists a 50-50 split. One might also argue that the result of the lawsuit raised the possibility of eliminating the CRNA supervision requirement under Medicare altogether. But one thing was certain, recognizing that the funding for the Minnesota lawsuit had largely depended on the generosity of individual CRNA donors from across the nation, it became clear to the AANA that there was a desperate need for some sort of emergency war chest that individual SANAs could tap into. This revelation essentially revolutionized the AANA's strategy for supporting SANAs going forward. The promise of autonomy, leading to the HCFA supervision ruling, 1997 to 2000. By the mid-1990s, the shift toward non-physician providers, besides CRNAs, had quite literally become front-page news. Prominently featured in the September 30th, 1997 edition of the New York Times, the battle over primary and specialty care services pitted non-physician providers such as nurse practitioners and other specialists against physicians and their allies. Tolerated on the less profitable and less prestigious periphery, rural and low-income care, these non-physician providers were now moving into more lucrative and respectable urban and suburban care settings. Of course, this was old news to nurse anesthetists, whose professional history to that point had been defined by struggles with physicians protecting their economic interests. With other non-physician providers now facing similar struggles, the affinity between them and CRNAs grew. It was a development a long time in the making. Originally unable to find common ground for some 60 years earlier, the AANA had finally become an affiliate of the ANA in 1993. At the same time, proposals at the federal level were being made to protect non-physician providers. On April 23, 1997, Representative Charlie Norwood, Republican from Georgia, introduced the Patient Access to Responsible Care Act, PARCA, which carried a provision to prevent discrimination or collusion against non-physician providers on the basis of their education and/or certification. an alliance of like-minded organizations, including the AANA, threw their support behind the bill and Representative Norwood's re-election campaign. But resistance to this provision came swiftly. In such a competitive healthcare marketplace, physicians felt increasingly threatened by the proliferation of qualified and less expensive non-physician providers. Prohibiting discrimination against these providers most certainly would lead to greater competition overall. For this reason, the AMA and ASA lobbied ferociously against it. One of the contentions made by opponents of PARCA was that it would increase healthcare insurance premiums by as much as 30%. These increases would come not from the anti-discrimination clause, but from patient protections inherent to the bulk of the legislation. It was a common and highly effective tactic that has become ubiquitous in campaigns against even the most common-sense healthcare reforms. The AANA fought back against this assertion as they and other member organizations of the PARCA Alliance pointed to an independent study conducted by a former HCFA analyst. The study suggested that opponents of PARCA grossly exaggerated the increase, with premiums estimated to increase by a mere 2% to 3%. In the end, however, Norwood conceded on the anti-discrimination provision. In a bid to retain core aspects of PARCA, in spite of this defeat, the AANA and its membership had reason to be hopeful. Within the Medicare portion of the Balanced Budget Act, BBA, of 1997 was a series of patient and provider protections, including an anti-discrimination provision that prohibited Medicare and Medicaid managed care plans from discriminating based on a provider's license and certification. Under this provision, plans could not exclude CRNAs from participation or deny them reimbursement solely because they were not physicians. A victory for CRNAs in every sense of the word, the patient and provider protections inherent in the BBA were not the only good news on the horizon. Word had spread that the HCFA was considering a regulation that would eliminate federally mandated physician supervision of nurse anesthetists. The legal thrust of the debate over physician supervision of nurse anesthetists can be boiled down to a single question. Were anesthesia services within a nurse's scope of practice? In establishing the parameters of their profession, physicians during the early to mid-19th century had pushed states to pass laws barring those who had not attended medical school from practicing medicine. Though made in the name of public health, this push was also economically vital to the future of the medical profession. This single development was responsible for elevating itinerant and perpetually insolvent healers to members of the most lucrative guild in modern American history. The federal mandate for supervision stems from attempts by nascent anesthesiologists in the early 20th century to assert that nurse anesthetists were practicing medicine without a license. Though these assertions were ultimately struck down in the courts, it was the assurance and support of surgeons and hospital administrators that effectively greased the wheels of justice at the time. Implicit in this assurance was that nurse anesthetists were merely carrying out a function prescribed by and under the supervision of a medical doctor. Thus, the Medicare Part A guidelines, established in 1976, mandate that a physician, not necessarily an anesthesiologist, must be close by and available to provide immediate and personal assistance and direction. Further, Medicare Part B's fee schedule delineates between supervision and medical direction. The guidelines for receiving payments for medical supervision suggest a more hands-off approach than that of medical direction. For example, an anesthesiologist would be eligible to receive reimbursement for the medical supervision of more than 4 CRNAs without having to be present during their procedures. Medical direction, on the other hand, mandates that the anesthesiologist direct no more than 4 CRNAs and have a more active role in the care provided. But again, the supervision mandate did not stipulate that the supervising physician needed to be an anesthesiologist. Nor did fee schedules for medical direction preclude CRNAs from receiving full compensation when self-directed. Thus, in many cases, CRNAs were already providing a high level of care with minimal supervision. All of this begged the question, was federally mandated physician supervision necessary? In late 1997, the HCFA came to the conclusion that it was not. In the December 1997 Federal Register, the HCFA proposed that more flexibility be afforded to CRNAs by allowing them to practice without oversight by another practitioner. This was echoed by the AHA and the National Rural Health Association, NRHA. Tim Size, president of the NRHA, reiterated that in more than 70% of rural hospitals, nurse anesthetists already functioned as the sole anesthesia provider. Despite providing the vast majority of anesthesia services for the better part of a century, nurse anesthetists had long labored for recognition and acceptance as legitimate care providers. One of the pillars upon which anesthesiologists justified their existence and higher salaries was that their medical training made them alone qualified to administer anesthetics without supervision. The elimination of this requirement would represent a sea change, theretofore unseen in the field. The significance of this statement was appreciated by both the ASA and AANA, with grassroots mobilization by interested parties beginning almost immediately. One of the contentions of CRNA Sandra Larson's 2004 doctoral thesis on this subject was that suddenly what had long been a dispute between the AANA and ASA quickly expanded to include hundreds of professional organizations, hundreds of legislators, the public, and scores of outside professional lobbyists and public relations firms. The HCFA was, in theory, an independent federal agency tasked with advising both houses of Congress on issues facing the healthcare system, but the reality was something quite different. As Larson pointed out, appointments and fiduciary leverage applied by executive and legislative branches could have a tremendous amount of influence on the HCFA's recommendations. Thus, the battleground had been set and the pieces were already in play. What followed was one of the most hard-fought battles over anesthesia care since its inception. The ASA's response was almost instantaneous. Within minutes after the conditions of participation outlined in the Federal Register were released, the ASA began developing a coordinated response. Public relations, lobbying efforts, and grassroots mobilization campaigns were launched, targeting the Society's membership, Congress, the HCFA, and the public. To reach the latter, the ASA sent public relations materials to press outlets and news organizations, including newspaper and radio ads, as well as push polls targeting senior communities. Efforts to influence seniors focused on familiar tropes of federal overreach, which smacked of hypocrisy given past attempts by the ASA to utilize this very agency to advance its own position throughout the Medicare era. For example, a January 16, 1988 press release titled "Medicare, Medicaid Agency's Proposal Places Patients at Risk," says American Society of Anesthesiologists, encouraged seniors to get involved, affirming they had the power to stop this irresponsible federal proposal in its tracks. Seniors, likely uninformed as to what supervision actually entailed, responded overwhelmingly in opposition to the HCFA's recommendations in ASA's push polls. The AANA was well aware of what this rule change would accomplish for its members and had been actively pursuing its adoption since the issuance of a draft rule removing the supervision rule was put forward in 1993. AANA President Scott Foster reminded the membership that the proposed rule would impact all CRNAs, not just CRNAs who practice independently. Further, Foster argued that the elimination of the HCFA supervision requirement was integral to the profession's transition to the new millennium. As such, the AANA did not waste any time entering the fray. Beginning in mid-January 1998, the AANA released a series of press releases supporting the HCFA's position, while calling for grassroots support from members and healthcare consumers needlessly frightened by the ASA's public relations campaign. Another matter of contention was the ASA's shifting position on the role of Congress in this process. The AANA was quick to point out in an open letter to Congress that just over 2 years prior, the ASA had asserted that issues relating to the treatment of Medicare patients, including anesthesia care, should ultimately be decided through reliance on the rulemaking process by the HCFA, the agency charged by law with that responsibility. The ASA echoed this position in their own newsletter in 1995 in November, reiterating that determining rules for anesthesia care belong to the HCFA and not in Congress. That the ASA was now asking its allies in Congress to legislate away the HCFA's ruling on supervision just 2 years after asserting that it was HCFA's unique responsibility to do so suggested that the ASA campaign amounted to little more than an effort to protect its members from open competition with CRNAs. The AANA also commissioned its own survey of Medicare patients, which favorably reflected that the vast majority supported the HCFA's findings and were fully satisfied with the care they received from nurse anesthetists. Advertisements were placed in a diverse array of publications and news sources, while public opinion was leveraged for support on Capitol Hill. While the AANA began by merely supporting the HCFA proposal, its own campaign shifted to disputing what they perceived as spurious facts put out by the ASA. The result was the most public display of an often vitriolic relationship between the two organizations to date. In many ways, the opposing public relations campaigns, though contradictory in message, were quite similar in strategy and structure. The resulting political battle defied party lines, reflecting the significance of public opinion in shaping legislative response. Although the HCFA had set April 20, 1998, as the conclusion of the public comment period, no ruling was provided, in what amounted to a victory for the ASA public relations campaign in that it had made inroads toward delaying implementation of the HCFA's findings. The current strategy had not delivered the knockout blow the society was hoping for. With so much hanging in the balance, they shifted tactics. The ASA began to push for more time and research in order to ensure that the proposed ruling was safe. Unable to provide evidence to support its claims that a disparity of care and outcomes between anesthesiologists and nurse anesthetists existed, the ASA sought to delay the implementation of the HCFA regulations through a call for and eventual promulgation of spurious research into anesthesia patient care outcomes. Moreover, the assertion that a study was needed suggested there was a dearth of existing data with which to evaluate CRNAs, a deliberate falsehood. Around the same time that the public comment period was scheduled to end, Senator Locke Faircloth, Republican in North Carolina, an ASA ally, roiled the waters with his Safer Seniors Medical Care Act of 1998, or the Anesthesiologist Job Protection Act, as the AANA referred to it. This bill opposed the HCFA's proposal on the grounds that it eliminated protections for seniors afforded by Title 18 of the Social Security Act, but it was a companion legislation introduced in the House by Representative Dave Weldon, Republican from Florida, a physician that was truly indicative of the ASA shift in strategy. The Weldon Bill, House Resolution 632, demanded that the HCFA proposal be delayed until the Secretary of Health and Human Services conducted a study on mortality and adverse outcomes rates of Medicare patients by providers of anesthesia services. The study would analyze the impact of physician supervision of providers of anesthesia services, or lack thereof, on such mortality and adverse outcome rates. To the uninitiated, this all sounded rather reasonable. Who wouldn't want a study to ensure the safety of patients after all? To those familiar with the history of anesthesia, however, it was clear this tactic was meant to delay and distract. First and foremost, the term supervision gave the impression that a physician, perhaps even an anesthesiologist, would be physically present to oversee the procedure. Seems simple enough, but further explanation is actually required. If the physician was a surgeon, for instance, they would clearly be present but focused on their own work and therefore unlikely or unable to oversee the administration of anesthesia. If the physician was an anesthesiologist, their physical presence in the operating room while anesthesia was being administered by a highly capable CRNA was typically not needed and frequently non-existent or at best sporadic. Many CRNAs asserted that supervision by an anesthesiologist was particularly uncommon in the late evening and overnight hours, a phenomenon that was referred to as the sundown rule. If prospective patients understood the limitations of supervision in practice, as well as to the extent to which CRNAs were already practicing without direct oversight, they might view it differently. There was also the matter of precedent. Over a century of experience and data had demonstrated that there was no discernible difference in care outcomes between anesthesiologists and CRNAs. Since the dawn of organized anesthesia services, nurse anesthetists had adapted and perfected advancements in the field and brought them safely to the forefront of care. For these reasons, nurse anesthetists were the first choice of prominent surgeons during the early 20th century, such as the Mayo brothers and George Crile. In addition, the U.S. military had relied on nurse anesthetists at home and on the front lines of every armed conflict since World War I. None of this was to say that physician anesthesiologists were superfluous. They, of course, also provided invaluable contributions to the profession in terms of innovation, service, and research. But to suggest that CRNAs required supervision by anesthesiologists and to mandate their presence in a hospital as an underutilized and often unseen fail-safe measure put an undue financial burden on both patients and hospitals. This was especially true when, in most cases, the needs of patients and hospitals could be met by a more cost-effective, highly educated CRNA. The AHA and NRHA shared this conviction, with the former noting that the provision gave hospitals much-needed flexibility, and the latter asserting the proposed rule change demonstrated that HCFA recognizes that nurse anesthetists are already providing care successfully without supervision. The ANA concurred, stating that in practice, the relationship between CRNAs and physicians has been that of professional colleagues working in collaboration with one another. Despite federal regulations asserting otherwise, the relationship is generally not a supervisorial one. This is particularly true in the case of operations surgeons, who lack CRNA's expertise in administering anesthesia and yet have been called upon to supervise them because of existing regulatory requirements. The ASA's call for a comprehensive study was not merely a delay tactic. The organization was aware that such a study was underway at the Center for Outcomes Research, an affiliate of the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Conducted under the supervision of Professor Jeffrey Silber, M.D., the study would go on to become the centerpiece of the ASA's case against the HCFA's recommendations. In a letter to AANA President Linda Williams from Jeffrey Kang, M.D., Director of the HCFA's Office of Clinical Standards and Quality, Kang suggested that the study's preliminary findings had given them some pause in making a final ruling regarding supervision. Circumspect, many decision-makers prefer to wait to view the final study before making any decision on the matter. With a projected completion date of mid-1999, a wait-and-see approach seemed reasonable. Yet 1999 came and went, without more than preliminary findings being made available. Meanwhile, the ASA continued to reference the yet unpublished study to strengthen its position. Anesthesiologists, hoping the study would be published in a large and neutral journal, such as the Journal of the American Medical Association or the New England Journal of Medicine, were ultimately disappointed. Instead, Silber and his colleagues chose to publish their findings in the ASA's flagship journal, Anesthesiology. The study's scope, which covered surgical outcomes in elderly Medicare patients, was a departure from the specialty of the Center for Outcomes Research and Silber, critical care pediatrics, but fit with the ASA's target demographic for its grassroots campaign. Nevertheless, the ASA's tactics proved successful. While the ASA-sponsored legislation, Faircloth and Weldon, had no chance of passing both houses of Congress, it was clear that the Society's real objective was to initiate controversy sufficient to delay the decision-making process. Just over 3 years later, the HCFA would publish its final ruling, thereby affirming their initial recommendation that CRNAs be allowed to provide anesthesia services in the absence of physician supervision. Though the outcome remained the same, the delay proved costly.